morning, good evening, good afternoon, a croeso, welcome. My name is Mhara Starling, I'm a Welsh witch, I'm the author of Welsh Witchcraft, and this is my channel where I explore the magic and lore of Wales with you. There is one Welsh concept, one Welsh idea, one Welsh force which has gripped the imagination of especially pagans. Pagans are incredibly interested in this force, this power, this idea that is found within Welsh magic and lore. And this concept, of course, you've read the title, is Awen. Awen. Now, Awen is something that is embedded into Welsh culture, and it's a very fascinating concept and idea, and it's one that is worthy of exploration. It is particularly loved by Druids today, and has become essentially the way to identify a Druid in the wild, so to speak. If you see somebody wearing a necklace with a symbol that has 3 rays on it, and you ask them what it is, they will often tell you that it is the symbol of the Awen. But sometimes they will simply say that it's the symbol of Druidry. It's almost as though the concept of Awen and the symbol of Druidry have become one and the same, which I have thoughts about, but anyway. But what exactly is Awen? How associated with Druidry is this Welsh concept actually? What does the word Awen mean? Where does Awen come from? And what does it do? All of these questions and more will be answered in this video, so stick around. If you've been around on this channel long enough, you will know that I've already done a video on Awen. It was one of the first videos that I ever made on this channel, but that video is quite old now, and it's from a time where this channel was very, very different. Back when I made my What is Awen video, this channel was dedicated more so as a reflective kind of vlog space, where I talked about my ideas, my theories, my practice, and things like this. And since I made that video, my channel has evolved and changed to become more so a place for education, more so a place to learn about Welsh myth and lore. And so I feel like people expect more of me than just reflection and personal gnosis and personal ideas nowadays. They usually expect to know a little bit more about the history and the lore when they come away from my videos. So I've started updating some of my old videos, and this is one of them. I'm updating my old Awen video. So this is What is Awen V2, version 2. The regenerated version, if you will. In order to explore Awen, I thought the best place to start would be with the symbol of Awen, because for most modern pagans outside of the Welsh cultural continuum, the first instance in which they will become aware of the concept of Awen is probably via Druidry, and specifically via this symbol that is on your screen right now. Now, one thing I have to make clear before I go on to talk about the symbol and its meaning and such, is that Awen is something that just exists within Welsh culture. It's something that we grow up knowing about. Not necessarily to say that we grow up learning about the deep esoteric meanings of the concept of Awen, but it is part of common vernacular, it's part of common speech. We talk about the Awen and we use the word Awen in everyday speech to this day, and for the most part, Awen is used within common speech, primarily to just mean inspiration, or specifically poetic inspiration. It is the inspiration that forces you to create something creative, to create art, essentially. So you'll often hear artists talk about how the Awen has touched them, or how something has awakened the Awen within them. I believe the first time I ever heard the word Awen being spoken, or at least the first time that I took notice of the word, was when a children's book author came into my primary school to talk to us about her life as an author, and of course I was very inspired, ended up writing my own book eventually as well. Not a children's book, but still, I suppose it could be a children's book. And she was talking at one point about what sparked her inspiration to write the book, and she said the phrase "ddoth yr awen I mi pam ... So translated it would mean the Awen came to me when ... and she went on to explain the moment that inspiration struck her and she decided she was going to write this book. And I remember I sat up and took notice of that word. I was like, Awen, that's nice, I like it. And of course, Awen is very much embedded into the culture of the Eisteddfod and such. But anyway, despite all that, The first instance that most people will come into contact with the concept of Awen outside of Wales is probably through the lens of Neo-Druidry and Neo-Paganism. Of course, if you show anybody this symbol within a modern pagan context and you ask them, what does this symbol mean? They will say one of two things. They will either say, that is the symbol of Druidry, or they will say, that is the symbol of Awen. It is a symbol that represents Awen. But where does this symbol come from? The antiquity of this symbol is up for debate, because you could argue that perhaps this symbol was drawn upon from some rather ancient sources. But for the most part, in this context, in the context of Awen, we do not see this symbol being used until around the late 18th and early 19th century by, of course, Iolo Morgannwg. Iolo Morgannwg is a very deeply interesting figure within Welsh culture and occulture in general. He's lauded today as a bit of a crackpot. He's seen as a forger, as this colonial, horrible, nasty, vicious person who made stuff up and we have to fix all the mess that he made. But in reality, there's more nuance that needs to go into the conversation when it comes to Iolo Morgannwg. Did he forge things? Did he claim to have ancient manuscripts? Did he muddy the waters? Yes, he did. But he was also quite a visionary, and we probably wouldn't be sat here talking about this stuff today if it was not for Iolo Morgannwg. Anyway, he deserves a video of his own. Perhaps I'll do a video one day. Perhaps I'll get a guest on to talk about him, because I know a friend who knows a little bit more about Iolo Morgannwg than I do. The symbol as we see it mostly today, with the 3 dots or the 3 circles around it, was a little bit of a later invention and is usually attributed to Ross Nichols, a figure who was very much influential in the rise of modern Druidry. But the 3 rays alone are attributed to Iolo Morgannwg and are still used today in modern Welsh culture. If you watch the Eisteddfod, the National Eisteddfod, you will notice that the robes of some of the Druids that run the Eisteddfod, basically, as well as the chair and a lot of the banners and such which adorn the Eisteddfod tents, have this symbol of the 3 rays. Though this symbol is usually today by modern pagans seen as either the symbol of Druidry or as simply the Awen, it is the Awen in symbolic form, the Welsh bardic tradition actually has another name for this symbol, and that name is a Nod Cyfrin. A Nod Cyfrin. A Nod Cyfrin translates to mean essentially the mystic note. And beyond that, beyond the symbol having a completely different name within the Welsh bardic tradition, it also has an entirely different meaning. If you were to ask a modern druid today what the symbol means, they would probably tell you that it represents the Awen. But rather than being literally the Awen, the symbol within a more Welsh-specific context is more so a representation of the light and the stream of Awen. It's almost like it's the effect of Awen in our world. And this is better explained by Iolo Morgannwg himself. Within the writings that Iolo Morgannwg left behind, he wrote quite extensively about this symbol and the concept of Awen in general. And in Baraddas, which is a collection of various writings by Iolo Morgannwg, he writes this about the symbol. The first of the signs is a small cutting or line inclining with the sun at eventide. The second is another cutting in the form of the perpendicular upright post. The third is a cutting of the same amount of inclination as the first, but in an opposite direction that is against the sun. What you'll notice when you read this is that he associates these symbols with the sun, or specifically with shadows cast by the sun. And if you want to read more about this, then I very much recommend reading the lovely book by my friend Christopher Hughes, Ceridwen, Celtic Goddess of Inspiration. He's written quite extensively about the history of the Awen and how it became such a commonly used symbol among Druids, but also how deeply entrenched it was with Welsh tradition and specifically with the influence of Iolo Morgannwg. there is essentially an entire mythos built up around this symbol. It's not just a random symbol that he plopped up and he said, this is now Awen, this now represents Awen. No, there is so much more that went into it than just that, and it's just another example of how much of a visionary Iolo Morgannwg was. Whatever we might think about him, whether we see him as a poetic visionary who gifted us with so much, or whether we see him as a off-his-tits crank who forged manuscripts and muddied the waters too much. Regardless, one thing that cannot be argued against is that he had a depth of knowledge of Welsh culture, he had a depth of knowledge of the things he was writing about, and he created entire mythoses about these things that he was writing about. But again, if you want to learn more about that, I very much recommend looking up Chris's book. And like I said, maybe we'll have a guest come on and we'll talk about Iolo Morgannwg in more depth. The word Awen itself teaches us a little bit about the very nature of this force. The thing about the Welsh language is that the Welsh language is a very poetic language, and every word in our language essentially tells a story. Our language was developed and created basically out of poetry, and so there are no definitive, easy translations for words. This is why if you went on an English to Welsh, or actually the other way around, skip that, reverse it, Welsh to English dictionary, and you wrote any Welsh word, you're going to come up with several, very many definitions that make up what that word means, and that's because of this poetic kind of essence that the Welsh language has. And because of that, a single word can tell you so much, and that's very much the case with Awen. Just the word itself can tell somebody who speaks Welsh a little bit about what it is that it means. The word, when translated by dictionaries and such, is usually translated to mean inspiration, poetic gift, muse, you know, the thing that moves you to create art. That is usually the translation that dictionaries and such go for. But when we look at the word on an etymological level, it seems to have links to other Welsh words, such as awel. Now, awel is a word that essentially means a breeze. It's that light, gentle summer breeze. Or sometimes it's a word that can denote a kind of air that's almost like a slight breath that comes out of something. So when we think about that, there is this idea that Awen might have something to do with air, or specifically with breath. And the connotation of Awen being associated with breath is something that I find particularly interesting, considering the concept is also deeply linked with poetry and art and the spoken word. You know? There have been many theories and ideas as to the actual origin of the word Awen, but the truth is we don't actually know. We can guess that it has an association with words like awel, which means breeze or breath. We can guess that perhaps the wen at the end of the term might have an association with holy or blessed things. But to be honest, we'll never truly know what this word means, but the word in and of itself can tell us a story, can give us almost an artistic idea of what the Awen is. And that is only furthered when you look into how Welsh culture has interacted with the force and idea of Awen. Now, Awen being a force that is deeply associated with poetry, of course it's going to be associated with the greatest poets that we had in our history, the bards. The Welsh bardic tradition, y traddodiad barddol, is something particularly interesting and something that I think a lot of people outside of Wales will never fully wrap their head around. One thing about the bardic tradition that people can't seem to grasp is that it is not something that is locked in the past. It is not something that is purely a thing of the long-forgotten, antiquated past. The bardic tradition continues to this day, and the rules of Welsh poetry have barely changed in almost 1,000 years. There was a period of time in Welsh history when the bards were revered so strongly, and that is still the case today in Wales as well. Perhaps not to the extent, we don't have kings that are taking in the bards and becoming patrons of the bards today, but it does say something about Welsh culture when the highest accolade, the highest reward that you can be given in this country is not given to our greatest soldiers, our greatest warriors, to our richest people, to our lords and such. The greatest accolade given in this country by our nation, by our culture, is given to poets. We give them the chair, we give them the voice in the Eisteddfod to basically put themselves out there and be judged by bards and druids at this cultural festival, and they are awarded the best poet if their poetry is good enough to be awarded as such. So still to this day there is an echo of the bardic tradition, and the bardic tradition is still continuing because we are still living in a nation which very much embodies that love for poetry and for the spoken word. Gwlad Beirdd a Chantorion is one of the lyrics in our national anthem. A land of bards and singers. That's what we call ourselves. We are the nation of bards and singers. And there is evidence to point us towards the idea that within the Welsh bardic tradition, the Awen has long been an important, integral concept and a force that the bards would connect to. In the bardic tradition, there is evidence that the Awen itself was considered a force which starts its life in the otherworld, in Awen, in the depths of the otherworld. The best example of this can be found in a poem that's in the Book of Taliesin. In a very long poem titled Angar Cyfundawt, now that's Middle Welsh right there, and Angar Cyfundawt essentially translates to mean a hostile confederacy of bards. A hostile kind of interaction between bards. It's a very, very long poem, and there's a lot of themes that go into that poem that are very, very interesting and could be an exploration all in and of themselves. But we're focusing on Awen in this video. So what does the poem say about Awen? Well, let me read you what the poem says about Awen. There are 140 ogyrfen in inspiration, 80 in each one. In Awen, he ranged the divisions of inspiration. In Awen, he made them. In Awen below the earth, in the air above the earth. Essentially, this poem is saying that Awen, in and of itself, is created and formed by divine hands, first and foremost, in the otherworld, in Awen. If you have an interest in Welsh mythology, you'll be familiar with Awen. Awen is essentially the deep, the very deep. It is the otherworld of Welsh culture. The poem then goes on to explain that, like a river that flows and is connected to all things, the Awen emanates out from the otherworld into our world. So there's this idea within the bardic tradition that essentially the Awen is this almost mystical force that emanates from another world, another place, and it reaches into our world, and like a river that flows gently, it makes its way into our reality, where we breathe it in, and as such it takes form within us, and we create from its very power. We are transformed, we are changed, we see the world differently, and we cannot help but view the world as artistic, poetic geniuses. Interaction with the Awen essentially awakens visceral transformation within us. It forces us to become much more open to the very artistic forces at work in the world. And because of this, the bards essentially found their connection to Awen very important. So you'll find numerous poems throughout the bardic tradition, throughout the ages, throughout various different centuries, you will find poems about the force of Awen. So much so that around the 19th century, some poets started denouncing the Awen. You'll sometimes find some poems written where the poet will denounce the idea of Awen because of its connection to a witch. We'll talk about that later. Another group of people beyond the bards who used to associate themselves with the concept of Awen were a group of soothsayers known as the Awenyddion. The first instance we have of the Awenyddion comes from around the 11th or 12th centuries, I forget. And essentially they are described as being the equivalent in Wales to the oracles and prophets and soothsayers of other cultures. They are people who can get themselves into a trance-like state, connecting to that force of Awen, to that divine force, and through that they can decipher hidden knowledge. Now, that is something that I think deserves an exploration of its own, so I will be making a video on the Awenyddion very soon. But who's this witch who has an association with Awen? But of course, it is Ceridwen. One of the most famous folktales pertaining to the Awen is likely that of the birth of Taliesin, and of course this story is associated with Ceridwen. In modern paganism, Ceridwen is viewed as a goddess of witchcraft and magic and inspiration. Essentially, in this story, Ceridwen has a son. The son is called Morfran, and he is so very deeply hideous that nobody can look upon him without feeling sick, without feeling disgust. And so he is disrespected and he is unvalued in the world because of his wretchedness, because of his ugliness. So much so that people call him Avagdde, which translates to mean utter darkness. They stopped calling him Morfran and started calling him Avagdde. Feeling this mother's desire to have her son be accepted by the world, Ceridwen realises she can't change his appearance, but she could potentially make him a much more knowledgeable, learned and prophetic man, and as such people would overlook the way that he appears and would instead see him as a wise and sage prophet. And so she goes and she finds a potion, a spell, that will create a essentially pure form of Awen that can be drunk by her son. And this Awen is distilled into a small potion, and once Avagdde drinks this potion, he will become knowledgeable of all things, past and present, seen, unseen. He will know all, and he will be valued and respected by the world. Of course, in the story, everything goes tits up in the end, and the potion ends up being drunk by somebody else, and then this chase ensues where Ceridwen turns into a greyhound, he turns into a hare, he jumps into the water and becomes a salmon, she becomes an otter, he jumps out and becomes a little bird, and she flies after him as a hawk, and then he turns himself into a grain of wheat, and she devours him as a hen. And then she's pregnant with him and she gives birth to Taliesin. And Taliesin means the radiant brow. And he becomes a very pivotal figure within the Welsh bardic tradition, within Welsh mythology, within everything essentially. He's a very important figure. And of course, in future, I will be making videos all about Ceridwen and Taliesin and all that as well. Because of this tale, and because of their associations with such thing, both Ceridwen and Taliesin are figures that are deeply associated with the Awen, not just in a modern pagan context, not just among witches and druids and woo-woo folk like me, but also among the bards of Old Wales as well. We see various poems which refer to Taliesin as being the most revered, most sought-after bard in all of Wales, and we see poems being written about how important Ceridwen is to the flowing force of Awen, which is very interesting considering that most of the information we have about the bardic tradition from Wales comes from a highly Christianized period. It's interesting that these bards who would sing the praises of God and Jesus and Christianity were also singing the praises of a witch. And that's why by the turn of the 19th century we start to see some of the poets of Wales start to denounce the concept of Awen because of its association with Ceridwen. There is one poem in particular which talks about how a poem denounces the Awen because his Awen does not come from the cauldron of a witch, but from his love of the land itself, which to me still sounds very pagan. Today, Awen as a concept and a force is celebrated by various different groups of people. As I said, it's still part of the very living culture of Wales today. It's not something that has been lost into the mists of time. It is something that is very much part of the living culture of Wales today, which is why if you are a pagan, a druid, a witch, who is not from Wales, it might serve you to listen to Welsh voices when it comes to what exactly Awen is, rather than just listening to the teachings of non-Welsh Druid orders and such. But beyond that, the Awen has become a deeply, profoundly important concept to neo-Druidry, to modern pagan Druidry. So much so that when people see this symbol, once again, they will either think it is the symbol of Awen, or they will literally say it is just the symbol of Druidry. It is the symbol of identifying modern Druids, which is a bit debatable. One thing I want to make clear, and I'm saying this as somebody who is essentially a member of two Druid orders. I'm part of the Anglesey Druid Order and another modern Druid order as well. Whilst indeed the Awen and Druidry are deeply linked, and that probably goes all the way back to Iolo Morgannwg, because after all, modern Druidry as it exists today probably wouldn't exist as it exists today without the influence of Iolo Morgannwg. But despite that, it's important to note that Druids don't own the Awen. Druids are not the owners of Awen. It is not purely a druidic concept. And if it is a druidic concept, it's debatable as to whether it can be considered a druidic concept outside of the idea of much more contemporary versions of Druidry. We have no evidence that points us towards the idea that the ancient Druids had any belief in Awen. It is a concept which, within written record, we only know is associated with Welsh culture, and specifically with the bardic cultures of Wales. It is not something that we know definitively had any links to ancient pre-Christian Druidry. But of course, the bloody Druids never wrote anything down, so we don't know. It could have been, they could have had Awen or a similar concept within their customs and traditions as well. Personally, as both a Welsh person and as a pagan, as a witch, as somebody who practices magic, I have various thoughts and ideas about the Awen. The Awen is profoundly important to my practice and everyday life. I revere and venerate the Awen almost like a deity in its own regard. I have an altar set up purely to the force of divine inspiration, to the force of Awen itself. Awen, in my eyes, is a connecting force. It is that thing which connects all things together, but it is also a transformative, otherworldly force. It is a force that grips you tightly, and with you, as a sort of symbiotic relationship, awakens a part of you which holds the very depths of the otherworld itself. So I tap into the Awen when I'm creating art. I tap into the Awen when I'm writing, when I'm dancing, when I'm creating art in any capacity. I also tap into the Awen when I am making magic, when I am creating a spell, when I'm weaving magic into the world. And I think one misconception that I've found about Awen is that the Awen is essentially this force that takes the wheel, so to speak, that you breathe in the Awen and it is the Awen that creates anything inspired that you create. And that's not the way I personally view Awen. I view Awen as a otherworldly force, as this divine otherworldly force which connects us to all things, to all realities known, unknown, seen and unseen, but that once it has been breathed into us, once we have accepted a part of the Awen into us, once we've interacted with the Awen, it then becomes this two-way conversation between that force and ourselves, that we are an important ingredient, so to speak, in the potion of whatever that Awen accumulates into. Does that make sense? Essentially, I don't think of it in the same way that some people might say that, you know, oh, you didn't write that book. You were taken over by a mystical divine force, and it was that mystical divine force that wrote the book. I don't believe the Awen is that. I believe the Awen is more so a symbiotic relationship, a two-way street. It is the very force of all connected things making itself apparent to you so that you can connect to the very depths of yourself in order to bring forth those things, those gifts, those offerings that you have for the world in whatever form that might be. Awen, within a Welsh cultural context, is spoken of historically predominantly as a force associated with poetry and with prophecy. But personally, I believe that the Awen is at play in everything that is creative, in everything that is touched by something beyond ourselves. And we all know it, don't we? We've all seen a piece of art that has stirred us to our very soul. We've all seen things and witnessed things, heard a song being sung by a child in an event and gone, oh, there is something more beneath that voice. There is a moving, animate quality that is driving that person's artistic qualities there. And to me, that is the Awen. So what are your thoughts on Awen? Let me know in the comments below. Do you have any nuggets of wisdom to share with me? I would love to hear them. And also, how does the Awen move you? How are you moved by the Awen itself? How do you create art? Do you create poetry? Do you see the Awen as a force in your magical practice? I would love to know. Thank you so much for joining me today. Diolch o galon am fod yma. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click subscribe, and also check out all the links down below in the description. I can be found across most socials. You can find me on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Threads. I'm everywhere. And don't forget that my book, Welsh Witchcraft, A Guide to the Spirits, Lore and Magic of Wales, is out now and available to buy from wherever you buy books from, really. And I will see you in the next video. Diolch. Ta!